welcome to a special edition of the Constitution and American Life with the Friends of Publius. As today we are going to color outside the lines and focus our discussion on the Constitution and the election of 2024. Allegedly, in 1787, Benjamin Franklin was asked by a fellow citizen what kind of government had the framers created in Philadelphia, and he responded with a republic if you can keep it. So here we are, some 8 days until the election of 2024, and voices from both sides of the aisle are saying that this is the most important election ever, or at least since 1860. Thus, we may be on the precipice of losing our republic. Just this last week, the Democratic nominee and some former members of Mr. Trump's previous administration labeled Trump a fascist and stated that if he wins, America will go down the road to authoritarianism. Mr. Trump and his acolytes have announced loudly that if the Democrat were to win, she will destroy America and thousands will die. It seems that no matter who wins, the apocalypse is upon us. It is not the tradition of the FOPs to go that deep into the political realm, but when you have a program that focuses upon civic education and the Constitution, it is virtually impossible to stay completely away from the dirt and grime of American politics. Also, recent polling reveals that less than half of Americans believe that constitutional democracy does a good job representing the needs of the people, and over 75% of the American people believe that constitutional democracy is under threat. So what we would like to focus on in this next hour or so is the charge coming from both sides of the political spectrum that if their opponent wins, America's constitutional democracy is doomed. So what about the Constitution? Was it structured in such a way as to prohibit the rise of tyranny? Does the constitutional arrangement provide the necessary guardrails, both before and after an election, that would prohibit the apocalyptic outcomes that both sides claim will occur? That is what we will focus on for the next hour or so. But before that, let's start with a little levity and present our two opening segments, the FOP question of the day and this day in history. So first, the question of the day. Do you agree, and this is for students and teachers hopefully maybe to lead students in discussion or students to discuss in their units. So do you agree with many Americans that the federal government needs to be slimmed down and spending cut significantly, and thus support the dismantling of the Departments of Education, Labor, and Veterans Affairs? Explain. Have a nice discussion on that limited government subject there. So let's move on to this day in history. And so this day in history, in 1886, the Statue of Liberty was officially dedicated. Is this a major, moderate, or minor moment in history, Mr. Moore?
I'm going to go minor, moderate. I'm going to invent a new category. I mean, Chris invented one a couple weeks ago, so I'm going to
I copied that from you.
Oh, really? Okay. I'm going to go. Yeah, I'm going to go. Not that big a deal, but moderate, and it's largely a symbol. Symbols and symbolism are critical, I think, to a national narrative, and certainly that the statue in the New York Harbor is quite symbolic. I mean, quite profound. I mean, if we've ever, I mean, I was there several years ago, and so I mean, substantively, it's hard to tell. I mean, you have all the immigrant stories about seeing the statue when they came in the harbor. So I'll be a little bit generous. I've just kind of talked myself into a moderate here in the last minute. So,
Professor Williams.
Yeah, I was going to comment that I think I'm with it. Well, I'm thinking with Tim. I think it's moderate. My grandfather, who came over from Portugal when he was 17, spoke very fondly of seeing that, and that it was an important symbol. And now that they have you could pay to have your family's name out there on a plaque and everything. So I think symbolically, I think it's definitely important. I recall when I visited, correct me on this, I think there was an issue with actually the erection of it running out of money. And didn't local citizens groups kind of come together to help fund if that is true, and I'm only half remembering it, then it would raise up to maybe a little more than moderate, because I think we're going to be talking about it in the next hour, just about guardrails, about issues in America, and about social trust is going to come up, and about how we relate to each other. And I think that that was a moment in the 1860s and 70s where a group of people would come together and put their time and resources into it. So if that story is true, students, then I'm going to go with moderate.
Professor Kavanaugh.
Well, I'd like to say major, but I just can't bring myself to pull the trigger on it because it's major in terms of symbolism. And you're right, Mike. The statue sat unassembled for a number of years until the New Yorkers, started pinching pennies to pay for the pedestal. As a matter of fact, there's in a park. It was just the arm and the torch that was displayed.
Yeah.
And when you see that for the first time in a photograph of just the arm and the torch being displayed and people walking by going, wait a minute, could that be? And it was, because they couldn't get it together because of the economy to pay for a pedestal. When they finally do, they pay for the pedestal and put it up. But for people like you said your father, Mike, or your grandfather?
Grandfather, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for thousands upon thousands and thousands of people, I mean, that was the first thing they saw, right? In the golden lamp of liberty. But then it immediately becomes a symbol, as we're all aware of, the editorial cartoons, against immigration at the turn of the last century, incorporating the Statue of Liberty. People, with Emma Lazarus' great poem, The American Colossus, which she wrote as a fundraiser. So there's a couple editorial cartoons where they're literally, these garbage scows are dumping these immigrants from Europe at her base. She's pulling her dress up like she's seen a mouse or something. So she immediately gets pulled into the debate about immigration. So I would like to say major, but I just don't know. I mean, considering how well we have or have not, lived up to that poem.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, maybe you can have your own conversation on
do we get to
rating
ask
that,
you?
moment
do we
in
get to
history in your
ask you,
history
David?
classes. Excuse me?
Do we get to ask you any of the, like?
Yeah, what do you think? Major, moderate?
No, I don't have any thoughts about it. That's for you, the guys, the scholars, to share your thoughts on it.
Okay.
So hopefully those that in the audience again have your own conversation about that there with Lady Liberty. Some of us have said we should probably send it back to France, given our current status on immigration and stuff. But and maybe that'll come up in the next hour or so. So let's begin our discussion on the Constitution and the election of 2024 coming up here in a week or so. Normally, we kind of go in a set order. Here, I'm hoping that this can be a little bit more free flow amongst the friends of Publius here. And because none of the questions are necessarily targeted to some of the expertise that each of them have, they might or might not. So hope bear with us here as we try to have kind of a more open discussion about this subject. So I think the first thing that needs to be asked is maybe to address to some degree the hyperbole, if indeed it is hyperbole, that surrounds this election, because we tend to hear the same thing every 4 years, that each election is the most important election, all right, either in our time or in history. And so I'm wondering, friends, what do you think? Is this the most important election in American history or in your lifetime? How would you assess that there? How do you even assess that, especially since all of you are involved in education there, and you deal with younger people than yourselves? If that comes up, how do you set up some kind of assessment of how we would measure there? Mike, any thoughts?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to call on you. I think I'm more comfortable on doing that there. Plus, you were actually looking into the camera.
There's that free flow.
Yeah, he was actually looking into the camera there. So
yeah, I'll start us off. I think yeah, I think the politicians will say it's the most important election every cycle because they're trying to get out the vote. I think there is something different about this election. Um, I don't know if I'll argue it's the most important, but it's the most important in my voting lifetime. Um, I was just thinking about as preparing for this, thinking about the election in 1864 during the Civil War, and how a lot of Lincoln's advisors really thought it was going to be much closer than it should be because of the Emancipation Proclamation, and how if McClellan would have won that election, he probably would have sued for peace and slavery would have stayed in place. I think that was a very important election, and then I was just I think it was during I think Fareed Zakaria was talking about this. I think I'm maybe mixing up. In 1952, when what would have happened to NATO if Eisenhower was not the Republican nominee, and what would have happened to America's engagement in the world, I think, what was in retrospect maybe really important. Uh, I think it's the most important of my lifetime because I think that unlike maybe differences on policies that we heard about all during this century, um, I do think that presidency um, under President Trump, it's gonna push a lot of our democratic norms, like we know because it happened the first time. And I think that that's something that should be on the voters' minds as they do this. I don't think it's on as many minds as nominee Harris would like, to be honest, but I think that there's something bigger about this election because it feels like the entire system, something could happen to the entire system in a way that maybe wasn't the case when we were voting in 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush.
Oh, was it
I
oh,
no, go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Chris.
Tim. Well, some professional development last week, and we had a political science professor from North Carolina, and he said his wife is a registered independent in North Carolina. He said she gets a minimum of 3 phone calls a day. But also, the state board of education in North Carolina called them and said, this is obviously a hugely contentious election. We'd love for you to do a Zoom meeting for our social studies teachers in the state and to help them walk them through the election. There's only a couple problems. You cannot mention either candidate's name, and you cannot mention either political party. And he said, how am I supposed to talk to teachers about maybe one of the most contentious elections in recent memory without mentioning the candidates or the parties? And they said, well, we're not sure. He goes, well, I don't think that will be doable. And so he didn't do it. So, I mean, that tells you they were so worried about perhaps offending people one way or the other that they told them to not invoke the names or the parties. I think I'm going to have to agree with Mike. This may be the most important election of my lifetime, my voting lifetime, and uh, I mean, I think there are things on the ballot that aren't on the ballot. I mean, the former president that is running incited a coup last time. He had his marchers, go into the Capitol to try and stop the process. That's never happened in our nation's history. And the same guy is on the ballot again. And he just had a rally at Madison Square Garden yesterday, and one of the speakers, Tucker Carlson, who is allegedly on the Russian payroll, saying there's no way that Harris would get 85 million votes, which, by the way, is only 4 million more votes than what Biden got. So they're already laying the groundwork for violence, much like there was violence on January 6th. So this is very concerning to me, I think. And so this is I think I'm going to agree with Mike. In my voting lifetime, this is our biggest election.
Professor Moore?
Yeah, I think I don't think this is the most important election in our history. Uh, I mean, to carry on Mike's logic, I mean, I mean, if you want to talk about really contested elections, 1824, the corrupt bargain, 1876, the sellout, pulling the troops out of the South. You had oh my gosh, I think the significant election of 64, 19. You get the Great Society and the escalation of Vietnam. 2000, Bush v. Gore. So I think in fact, 1888, kids, look into 1888. What an unbelievably awful presidential election between, I think it was Hayes and Cleveland, or no, Harrison and Cleveland. So in our history, no, I think there's plenty of evidence to do that. In lifetime, I probably would be prone, but again, as a historian, I like your question, David, about rubric. What's the standard by which you would make this call? This is the most significant. And one of the things, I mean, I'm kind of a historian, and so I usually don't make pronouncements on the front end of election. To me, you got to look after the election and how all the ripple effects, the political effects, the economic effects, the cultural effects. And so I guess I'm very reticent to step outside the verdict of history down the road after the election to me looking backwards. It's easier to be a Monday morning quarterback on that. So my rubric is usually history. Although I will say this, I saw you guys would be proud of me. I was doing a little presentism research this past weekend, and David Axelrod was being interviewed by, I don't know, somebody. He was with Karl Rove, and Axelrod made the point that he thought maybe this is the most significant because of the role of AI. And his point was all these crappy elections that, and we have a ton of them. His point was that the campaigning and the technology finds the voter rather than the voter using the technology. And I thought that was an interesting thought, that maybe the role of AI and technology makes this the most significant election in our lifetime. So I don't know. I mean, ultimately, I'm going to punt on lifetime, but I'm pretty convinced that it's not in our history. Although the ripple effects could be catastrophic.
Well, it seems to me that both candidates have kind of given us one category in the rubric, and that is who is the true defender of the Constitution. Because both sides say that if the other side is elected, there will be great undermining or damage to the Constitution, which made me wonder to what degree. I'm wondering, and Mike, I'm sorry, but this seems to be a comparative question.
Mhm.
How many other countries put their constitution at the forefront of popular elections? That this is somehow a mandate or a statement about who supports the Constitution more, and it leads me to believe that to some degree we as a nation fetishize our constitution. We turn it into something I often wonder if it was ever intended to be. And we've referenced that a little bit on some past segments there, but I don't know. I'm wondering, Mike, if you can help me. Am I, just being blind here? That yes, whether it's unwritten constitutions in England or it's Canada or South Africa, the Constitution is in the forefront of elections.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm going to borrow from, and thank you, Chris, for reminding all of us about the Levitsky Ziblot book. They open up their book talking about in Spain in the 1980s, right after the democratic transition, how there was this movement of folks to turn over that, right? And how it really took a response from the elites, I guess. And I forget whether it was through an election or just a response to kind of hold the line on the democracy. So your point about whether there's been an election with the Constitution sort of at stake, I'm not sure, but there are examples like Spain or even France during World War II in terms of the Vichy regime. There are examples of societies making a decision to either uphold or to not uphold the Constitution, but sometimes it's not during elections.
Tim or Chris?
30,
any
I
thoughts?
think 32. I think 1932, maybe FDR. He invokes a lot of constitutional discussion during the campaign, and certainly immediately after he was elected, it came front and center. So I think maybe 1932 it was front and center.
Well, Dave, I agree with you. I think we fetishize our Constitution a great deal. I mean, I've ranted on enough shows about that in the past, that the flaws, and I think Levitsky and Zvilat also talk about what happens in South American countries too. They bring a lot of receipts in that book for sure, in terms of that. But I think, David, I think I agree, man. I think we put ourselves out front. The idea that somehow the preservation of the Constitution is at stake in this election. I don't that it might tend to be hyperbolic. And I do want to go back, because answering your first question, I was talking in my voting lifetime, right? When I wanted to clarify, certainly there have been other elections, as Tim pointed out, a lot of them. Obviously, 1860 stands to mind quite a bit. 1800 comes to mind quite a bit in terms of that. Well, whether it was revolution or not, it was a transfer of power, and that's something we had prided ourselves on. Is it preservation? I don't know, though. I mean, honestly, if we look into some of the policy proposals and we look at what may happen, of course, that's again requires a crystal ball. I don't know.
Well, I guess I'm wondering to what extent is policy. I mean, because every presidential election obviously is some kind of differentiation, on policy. But to what degree is policy directly connected to constitutionalism?
Well, it doesn't. It doesn't. I mean, that's a great distinction, David. That policy. I mean, we have this notion that my policies, as opposed to Mike's, my policies are rooted in the Constitution. So there's this, you want to link your policy to the sacred text. So I think now in my faith tradition that's called idolatry, but I mean I think Chris is being a little generous, David, you as well. We fetishize, but I think your point is really critical. That policy, we want our policy to be rooted in the Constitution because it makes it that uber important.
Well, I'm curious. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, no, I mean, Tim's point is, I think, great. If I'm for the Constitution, then clearly my opponent is against it. They must be an anti-federalist. They're against this stuff. So that part is the branding part too. But I think that I think we all four of us are pay enough attention that we can discern policy. I'm not sure that the average person. Boy, this sounds really bad. I'm not sure the average person is more of a personality as opposed to policy. I don't know. I mean,
well, is our Constitution that narrowly tailored that there has to be specific policy outcomes to fit within its parameters? That seems to be, I guess, the trouble I have, and it's on both sides. All right. But that seems to be the problem I have with it, is somehow, and I have it in my own community, this idea, well, our Constitution is founded upon limited government. And the 10th Amendment, says this. And you want to kind of say, well, wait a minute, and I think it is a real life conversation given the recent Supreme Court decisions. Are we really locked into an 18th century understanding and language? All right, of the Constitution. So that's what I'm wondering is, to what degree do you guys see policies or the Constitution narrowly tailored to certain policy outcomes?
Well, I think that, I don't want to get too far ahead of us here, but I think that we tend to believe, or we hope to believe, or maybe we're deluding ourselves, that the traditional guardrails, or these checks and balances and the separation of powers that the framers had given us in the document would keep policies within the four corners of the document. And I don't know that if those, and David, you mentioned the court, I'm not sure if all the traditional guardrails remain in place.
I read
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Well, go ahead, Tim, then I'll go.
Well, this exercise this week, David, has really put me way over my skis. So thank you. But I read this piece. I did some political scientists, which I really had to hang in there, Mike. And this political scientist said, "Look, we should, I mean, to this point about the Constitution, he said we shouldn't really be talking about invoking the Constitution. We should be invoking," and he kind of caveats and says, as corny as it sounds, the American dream. And he defines the American dream. Now, this was interesting. This is a subject I think of some debate. Liberty, equality, capitalism, rule of law, and intergenerational progress. So his point is, at any given time, the parties often, he thinks in every election we should talk about the American dream and those six things. And his point is that they could articulate policies within the American dream. Vote for us because it's a vote for fill in, and clearly they would have to explain in these American dream criteria, these rubric, these standards, what their policies are going to be. So it kind of minimized this overheated rhetoric about our Constitution, and policy can be framed within this American dream, these six criteria as this political science defined it. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, let me build on that because I don't know. Maybe for us it lowers, what did you just say? It kind of how'd you just say it? If we think about it, the American dream and not the Constitution, it kind of lowers the temperature.
Well, you're not sentencing the other side to
Right.
the pit of hell. Right, right.
I mean, I think for us and folks who probably watch this, I think that makes sense. I think for the ordinary American citizen, the American dream, the American way of life, and the Constitution probably are all just kind of in the same thing. Because I was thinking
Yeah.
about every politician, I can think of every campaign, someone's like, your American way of life is at stake in this election, right? And so to Dave's specific question about does the Constitution prescribe outcomes? I don't think so. I think what the Constitution is meant to do is provide the process and the limits of the process. I mean, there are very constitutional legal ways for us to regulate um, what's out on the radio and televisions and maybe even the internet, right? It's not accepted practice for one branch of government or the president to just say, I'm going to favor this one over this one. That outcome might be very constitutional and very American in some sense if done in a particular way. I think what this election highlights, because of what we saw during the Trump presidency, is this disregard or this wanting to not play within that process to get the results, right? That maybe could be gotten in a process that would be constitutional. It's just going to take too long. And it's not going to address the real anxiety and fears that I think a lot of Americans have right now about where the country's going.
Well, let's talk about the constitutional arrangement and kind of Tim and Chris, since you're the most familiar with the language of the Constitution. I'm curious about, you'll hear this concept called guardrails, and that our constitutional arrangement is about guardrails that are institutionalized to limit power, to make sure that nobody goes out of their lane too far. So I'm wondering what guardrails specifically to deal with elections, all right, exist that were intended to make sure that we know that one of the motives, purposes of our Constitution is to create stable a government, all right, there. So when it comes to the constitutional process of elections, what are the guardrails there to guarantee our Republican form of government? Chris or Tim, want to start on that?
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I think the idea is of one, courts. We have courts at the state level and we have courts at the national level. As a matter of fact, right before we logged on, I saw a headline where some folks were petitioning the Supreme Court with some ballots in Pennsylvania because they did not like the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's ruling on what to do with what might be considered, I don't know the exact detail about provisional ballots, whether or not they should be counted. So we do have courts in place that are constitutional. to make sure the process is there. You know, we have the state governments in Article 1, Section 4 that we allow as we've talked about, the states to carry out those elections for various reasons. But we also have a Congress in place that can make rules if they need to, which have made rules. And we see another program about that. We've had a Congress that has made rules through the years about, you know, making sure we're overseeing those elections to make sure they're free and fair. You know, so we have those are some pretty basic guardrails, and we have an electoral college that was established in the Constitution for various reasons, to perhaps maybe keep the riffraff out. I don't know if you want to think of it that way. So to give the elites a little more control. I'll let Tim, you know, wax on that one. So we'd have some pretty basic things there in terms of just the election process itself.
Yeah, yeah, I don't want to, I'm not going to take the bait on the electoral college, Chris. You know, what's the good intentions are paved with highway to hell. Um, but I think registrations, how it's evolved over the year, you know, for better or worse, was one of those guardrails to prevent, you know, fraud. Now there's a big debate about whether those registrations are advisable or not. I think you know, Chris has pointed out the federalism, and that is critical, I think, in our history, the federal and state relationship on elections. But I'm going to tee Mike up here. It seems to me that the Voting Rights Act of 65, you know, and I don't know much about this, but there's this, wasn't the pre-clearance provision, would you consider that a guardrail, Mike, or not?
Oh, huge. I mean, I was getting ready to argue that the actual guardrails for free and fair elections were established for the first time in 65. And I would argue they last until 2013, until Shelby. And then they have largely, not completely gone for sure, but they've definitely been lowered.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't the federal, I mean, again, I think I heard some praise of the federal system of elections, and I would argue that constitutionally, all right, we actually promote instability by allowing 50 state election processes to occur. We tried, and Mike, I think, just talked about it. We tried to create some uniformity under the Voting Rights Act, but that's been whittled away, not just in Shelby. I forget the second case that dealt with Section 4. I know there was Section 5. I think there was another one on Section 4 that whittled away at that. So I'm just wondering, does the Constitution also stand in the way of stability when it comes to elections? Yeah.
I'm going to parse this out, and I'll say, you know, guardrail design is different than guardrail practices in history. So I can, with a straight face, say, yeah, electoral college was a structural design for stability. It was a guardrail against corruption, foreign influence. There was all kinds of things that justified those decisions in Philadelphia. But how practices is entirely different. So I'm going to parse it and say design is not the same as practice.
Yeah, and I don't know that when you said praise, David, I I'm not sure that I'm praising that system, because I think that the Congress could do a better job of
Right.
ensuring things. And I would, on top of Shelby County, I would throw in Rucho too, in terms of the gerrymandering cases. You know, the Supreme Court, who likes to say, "Oh, we don't get involved in the political process until we do," right? So the idea that racial gerrymandering is not okay, but partisan gerrymandering is fine, which is where the court seems to be on that right now.
And partisan gerrymandering can't be racial gerrymandering, or the two never cross
Yeah,
streams. Is that my
it's kind of
understanding?
like Ghostbusters. Don't cross the stream, right? But to say that somehow that they don't cross is like it's kind of detached from the reality on the ground, I think.
Let me give a counter argument that I don't fully believe, but let me just give it. Uh, the decentralization of our voting system, if we can call it that, it strikes me that for any individual or party to actually cheat, to go outside the rules in our system is going to take a lot of different actors to be involved. Versus a system like in South Africa, where there's an independent electoral commission with a commissioner in which all the votes immediately go to the center, right? And then you don't have as many people that you would have to influence in order to have the votes changed or anything. And I'm not saying that there's been any votes changed in any elections in South Africa or the United States. I'm just saying that our decentralized system has an advantage in that it's going to make it really hard for anyone to really, in a sizable way, cheat during elections.
Yeah, but we don't have to have a lot of entities, given the federal nature and given the electoral college, Mike, and especially given the cultural reality of how closely divided we are, almost a 50-50 nation, quite possibly. It's not going to take a lot of entities to change the outcome. It could be 2 or 3 states. Okay, it could be 1 state, all right, that in this federal system that goes off the rails or deviates from the process to some degree that can change the whole outcome, all right, of an election. Wouldn't you agree with that? That's a problem with our system, as it really is. A small group can, in fact.
I think the Election Integrity Act of 2023 tried to get at that, in that counties are going to have to certify by a certain date. The state legislature is going to have to certify, but it's going to be the governors of the states that has the final seal on it. And if you look at the makeup of most swing states right now, a lot of them are split states, meaning that their governor is Democratic while their state legislature is Republican. So I think I don't think you're wrong, David. I just think we'll see how well this Election Integrity Act actually works in practice. To Tim's point.
Mike, I agree with you in theory about the decentralization would make it much more difficult, because how many, out of the millions and millions of votes that are, they're going to be cast in this election, how many is it going to really take in terms of fraud to change things? But does that matter as long as people think that there was fraud in 2020? If people think what people think that, and people believe that there's fraud, does the actual reality matter? Because we've already seen this in the Georgia Board of Elections, which people got appointed, and they're already saying they're not going to certify election if the outcome is not what they think it should be, right? And they've already been slapped down in places because of this. So, yes.
Like I said, I was given an argument that I half believe with. It was an institutional argument, but you're bringing in a cultural factor or a political cultural factor that I say, yeah, I'm totally on board with what you're saying. There doesn't have to be any cheating at all, but if we're predisposed to believe that there is, then it's going to cause a lot of problems. You bet.
That's what worries me after November 5th, is what's going to happen after November 5th, right? I mean, you think about it, because we know the longer the time is for the ballots to be determined, the greater the petri dish is for conspiracy ideas. And yet you have states that won't even process the ballots, the mail-in ballots, until election time. And for students, when I say process the ballots, I don't mean counting who got the vote, Trump or Harris. I'm just saying that process the ballots to make sure the signatures match, the address matches, and everything's copacetic, everything's cool with that, so it goes into a pile so we can count that ballot. They're not even going to start that process till election day. And we know that that's going to make things longer, and that's going to actually, foment more conspiracy stuff.
I mean, I don't think Pennsylvania can do that until polls close. So,
Right, but Michigan started, today was the day Michigan could start to process it.
Right.
And it was fascinating. I watched an interview with a key person in the administration of their elections who was so excited. Yay, we get to start the process. And she made it very clear, we're not counting, but there's a ton of administrative work that has to go on. And the very fact that we have some states that won't even allow that to start, which means that it's going to be 4 or 5 days, quite possibly, after election day, which I think Chris said it well, just adds to, or increases the level of tension and heat in the process. Part of me wants to go ahead, Tim.
Well, I got infatuated with 1824 here this last week. Um, and I
Don't we
noticed.
all at some point? Don't we all at some point?
Stay up late at night and
Hey, don't make fun of me. I'm moving past 1800. You should be thankful, Chris. Um, the election, the vote for president was from October to December. Now you talk about we're talking about, a week, there's conspiracies, I mean, and I think the technology definitely has the ability to reduce this, and I think that's part of the frustration that we have all this technology. But can you imagine an election going from October to December? I mean, that's wow. I mean, that'd be something
I
else.
can. It was 2000.
yeah, took the words
Yeah.
right out of my mouth. Yes, I can
Yeah.
imagine that. I want to kind of stay on this theme about the Constitution itself. And I think all of you are familiar with Professor Erwin Chemerinsky. He's now Dean of Law at the University of California. And his most recent book that's going to be coming out is called No Democracy Lasts Forever: How the Constitution Threatens the United States. And you know, and there's a there's a program on YouTube that's an interview of Professor Chemerinsky as he talks about the book before it's being released here. But when I read this title, I immediately thought of Tim Moore and John Kaminsky, and I wondering what they would think about this. So I am curious that the title of that book. All right. Without, if you haven't read it or not, obviously you haven't read it, but if you haven't read a review or anything like that, what do you think about that perspective?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
This hasn't been free flow, David. I'll deflect and I'll say, you don't need Chemerinsky because Madison noticed this in his homework project there back in 86, 87. He assembled all these, he asked Jefferson for a bunch of books and he's using his own library. And he concluded that ancient, democracies in the ancient world were short, didn't have much of a shelf life. So I'd say that Madison notices it. And my argument would be that's why we created a system that wasn't overly democratic, hoping that the shelf life would be longer if we avoided pure democracy or direct democracy. So yeah, I think there is history bears that out that democracies aren't long for this life.
Well, I understand their fear in the 18th century of mass democracy or popular democracy, but they also weren't creating a constitution that was paralyzed, and stuck in time. It seems to me, at least, in the years that I've read about this document, that they intended, all right, that each generation would kind of add their twist on it there. And it seems that part of what Chemerinsky's point is that being trapped in an 18th century document written for an agrarian society, which was a slave society, being trapped in that world, it really is one of the main reasons why we're in the situation we're in.
Yeah, I think Chris, earlier last week I watched an episode that we did, and Chris had an interesting thought, and actually uh, it's probably profound. Again, this is creepy for me, agreeing with Kavanaugh so much this year, but we all know that a lot of those founders didn't think that, I mean, Jefferson went as far as to say maybe every 19, 20 years we ought to have a new constitution. And a lot of them did not. They were in a time period in the Revolutionary era where there was a lot of constitution writing. Even states, had multiple whacks at that apple. So I don't believe that they, in their hearts, would believe this thing could last in perpetuity. As much as we would like that, American exceptionalism, we would like to believe that. But Chris's point a week ago was, look, they weren't afraid to experiment. They were not afraid. I think that's a direct quote from you, Chris. So I think your question, David, is a great question, and I don't think the founders really would be as stuck in a framework as we have been, because their lives and that time period proved them to be flexible and willing to experiment.
this is pretty good. I've had this for a while. Democracy may not exist, but we'll miss it when it's gone. Right, Astor Taylor, fantastic read, especially for teachers. This would be one to add to your bookshelf for Unit 1. A lot of Greek philosophy in here for sure. And I was rereading some passages last night in preparation, and there was one that really struck me. In a democratic system, it has the seeds for its own demise. Right? Within a democratic system, the seeds are sown for its own demise. This is why, I would describe our system of government as a federal democratic republic. Certainly maybe heavier more on the republicanism, going back, David, to your opening quote with Franklin, but moving more towards democracy today, 1965, going to Mike's date there. But within a democratic system, the seeds are there for its own demise, which is it's kind of a troubling yet fascinating idea. That
People,
yeah,
people,
it's
people are the seeds.
it's the human nature aspect of things. So yeah, but I'm with you on this, David. I mean, I'm with Professor Chemerinsky. I'm glad he's finally seen the light that I've been preaching for a while now about certain things. But we could back to the fetishization of the document. If it's not work, let's change it. Let's fix it. Let's do something about it. But we're so reluctant to have the courage to do that, and I'm not sure why.
Well, and that's what's interesting. I mean, and then maybe that's the brilliance of the Constitution, that sovereignty is in the hands of the people, and therefore we do have the authority to fix this. And so in Chemerinsky's book, and it seems to me his message is also the same message as Levitsky and Ziblatt in their work, Tyranny of the Minority, in that all three of the scholars seem to argue that we can fix these problems. We can fix the Electoral College either statutorily or by amendment. We can fix, I mean, some of the other problems are gerrymandering, possibly money in elections there. The Senate,
Filibuster. I think
the
Professor
filibuster
yeah.
there. What do you see legitimacy in their argument, the collective scholar argument that we do have at our fingertips as a people the ability to fix these problems and make our system a much healthier constitutional democracy than it has been? Do you guys kind of agree with that premise there, Mike?
I do.
I don't,
I
Chris?
do. I'm in.
Well, I'm wondering because Tim just kind of quoted you that the founding generation was willing to experiment. Have we lost that cultural aspect of American society, Tim? Are we unwilling to experiment politically now?
Well, it's not apples to apples. The founding generation was willing to experiment as long as the elites were doing the experimentation. Now, I mean, even during the American Revolution, there's a great uneasiness about the implications of the Declaration. Gouverneur Morris was famous for saying, this revolution, we got to keep it within the banks. We can't have it flow over the banks. That revolutionary ethos is, it goes too far. And he saw that later.
Which we see in France.
Yeah, he's in France when that when the excesses of democracy really go crazy. So I think and I'm a little suspicious about the general public's reasonableness to do reform in this current environment. We're in a tremendous phase of populist spasm on both right and left, and I don't know that that's a great environment for constitutional reform. I mean, I think in theory, the popular sovereignty principle is remarkably wonderful, but even at the founding, there was some hesitancy about running that out to its nth degree.
Yeah, and I have 2 points here. The first about the founding, it seems to me it's not apples to apples because there wasn't the same sort of democratic constraints or information constraints on the elites. And I think there was space for experimentation if you had the elite status to do it, right? And in a societal acceptance of we'll take what these other elites are saying and we'll run with it, right? I know not completely, but um yeah, today, I mean, friend of the show, David Brooks, came out with an article this last week that I think his hypothesis is worth bringing up and thinking about. Where I think the title of the editorial was "The Election's Happening Too Soon," and his point was when he looked at like we're living in a time of great technological and economic change and a lot of anxiety. Fareed Zakaria in his newest book argues that it's even greater than the Industrial Revolution, right? So we're in the midst of that. I think we're just now maybe awakening to the fact that we are in this, right? And Brooks's point is when you look back at a similar time of the Industrial Revolution, 1890s, 1910s, and what ends with this progressive onslaught of constitutional amendments trying to fix the structures of government, he says it was preceded by first a cultural movement and second what he calls a civic engagement movement that then leads to a political movement. And what he doesn't talk about there that I was thinking about as I was reading that is about Putnam's stuff on social trust. And I think the basis for a lot of this is just this trust between ourselves as a society, which is at a low point in American history. So I think we have the ability and we have the space in our democratic society to make those changes. I just don't know if yet we have the kind of cultural movements that are bringing folks together for that experimentation and for those conversations that will then lead to putting pressure on politicians to make changes. Because I think whether you're a Democrat or Republican, no matter how you're going to vote in this election, it's very clear that as a society, we are unhappy with our lives. We are unhappy with the way government's functioning. We're all looking for a change, but we're just looking in different directions. And right now, the elites, the politicians are playing to those divisions to divide us even more, I think. I don't know if we have it within ourselves to withstand that and come together, but I think that's what it's going to have to take.
Well, and I think you echo, and I'm glad you brought that up because I guess in the last analysis, our system of government, probably like all other systems that have any element of democratic input, ultimately rely on kind of a faith and belief and trust in the system. And that's kind of the premise of Chemerinsky's book, is he argues that because the Constitution hasn't really been updated, all right, and the institutions of government haven't responded, all right, to the problems, the cynicism has increased exponentially. And if you remember some of the numbers I threw out at the beginning, all right, less than a majority of the country believes that representative government is responsive today. All right, and 75% of the country, and this is Pew Research, 75% believe that constitutional democracy is under threat, which increases, all right, the anxiety and cynicism, and it's this really negative circuitous relationship between these things, which again, I think in the end reinforces that the Constitution is somewhat of a problem. And I guess I want to kind of go back a little bit to Tim. Are we saying that the experimentation within the American political culture is both fleeting and brief? Because it wasn't just the 18th century. We had experimentation, one could argue, post-Civil War. We had experimentation, progressive period. We have some experimentation, I would guess, or openness. I don't know if experimentation's the right word, openness, post-World War II. But they're brief periods. Is that an accurate way to describe our culture?
Well, I mean, there's been a fair amount of historical writing on reform eras. And the way I read it is there's reform out of fear and there's reform out of like Teddy Roosevelt's a great example. He's a Republican progressive. Now he's not any great fan of like Wilsonian progressivism. He's just scared to death if we don't do something, what's going to happen. So I think reform can come from these populist spasms in effect change out of fear. but often proactive, it seems to me proactive reform does not happen. More often than not, it's out of fear if we don't act. And I want to, I may have misspoke a little bit about the founding. I mean, Massachusetts is an interesting example. They had elites write their constitution without the input of the towns, Joe farmers. And all the all the cities rejected it. They go back, you can't do that. So in Massachusetts, and there were a couple other states that was similar to this, where the masses didn't defer, but there is a high degree of deference at the founding. Massachusetts and a couple others might be the exception. So I'm sorry, I'm backtracking, but to your immediate question, David, I think the nature of reform is, if it's out of a conservative fear or a liberal optimism, I think is worth thinking about.
I think I think of American history sometimes as a pendulum, right? And so I think it's more reactive. I think in going back to the 1890s, where
Yeah.
the Gilded Age, and the amount of suffering by millions of people coming in, and the concentration of wealth. And what do we see out of that? You see organized labor. You see people jumping on the socialism train. You see people jumping on this, and you see unions pushing back, and you see the violence that is ensuing because of this concentration of wealth, and the incredible poverty. I mean, my goodness, there's a line describing New York City. Who was it? Russell Conwell. No, yeah, maybe Russell Conwell. He wrote Acres of Diamonds, but he also said that people are crammed together like maggots in a cheese, right? With powerful imagery. But you start to see the working man pushing back in a violent fashion, and we come out the other side, and what do we get? We get the 16th and 17th Amendments. We get the income tax, and we get the direct election of senators in response to what the society is doing at that time. And I'm not sure if Mr. Brooks included that in his editorial or not. That part, Mr. David Brooks, one of my favorite writers, and these guys all smiling because they know how I sometimes feel about Mr. Brooks. So I think it's more reactive, and we do that sometimes, and sometimes we react in a way to limit the damage, so to speak, so that pendulum doesn't go too far.
Well, yeah, I very much so. I think a heck of a lot. I mean, I go back to Franklin Roosevelt, especially the criticisms by the right of Franklin Roosevelt, calling him a socialist communist. And you're kind of going, well, given his background and his class and the way, oh gosh, I'm forgetting her name, the great female historian of our time, Dolores.
Kearns Goodwin.
Yeah, her work on Roosevelt and her argument, or one of the things she presented, is that his whole idea was to preserve the system, was to save democratic capitalism by, softening the edges of laissez-faire capitalism. He wasn't a socialist in any sense of the word kind of thing there, but the idea that sometimes thinking forward about preserving, which in some ways is a conservative idea. I want to just touch one last question and move to the post-election. But one last thing about the election itself, our electoral system, and I think we've kind of touched on it, we've had brief moments of pretty much a lot of stress on the system. They're 1824, 1860, clearly 1864. Mike, I'm glad you pointed that out. 1876, and we can keep. 2000. I mean, I'll be quite honest. I'm shocked. I know I was shocked at the time. In fact, I remember telling my students after all that happened in that election and it going to the Supreme Court that I would have bet $100. All right, that we would see reform, that we would see change of the electoral college system, and turn around a couple years later and nope, no change there. But there was definitely stress, if we all remember. Some of the news stories and mobs outside the places in Florida, rattling the doors and yelling and screaming there. And there's no doubt that 2020 was a stress on the system. And Chris, you kind of mentioned that, and you said, and you weren't the only one. A lot of people said, I don't know if the system can survive another stress test. There, I'm wondering what you guys think. Let's assume that 2024 plays out somewhat similarly, than 2020. Is this constitutional structure? Is it set up in a way that it can once again survive a stress test? I know it's prognostication. I'm just wondering what your gut tells you.
I'm going to share an anecdote that a former colleague shared with me and some other friends, and he was in line to vote, and a person came out of the voting line and yelling a candidate's name, and he's saying, "Well, I'm yelling it out here because they wouldn't let me yell it inside." And then he's asked the people in line. He said, "Are any of you voting illegally?" And some people chuckled. My friend said in his message, said some people chuckled. He said, "I'm not kidding. I've got a gun in my car, and I'm going to go get it. And if any of you are voting illegally, I'm going to do something about it." And so
Okay.
that was just a couple of days ago. And so as we get closer to the election and post-election, I don't think the Constitution is going to matter to some folks, unfortunately. You've already.
Mike or Tim? Prognosticate about can the system? I mean, we've put up with stressors before, and we've gotten through them. I'm just wondering.
Mike, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm not anticipating, no matter what the outcome is, that in January that the system is going to implode under its own weight. I think there is a more stress this time for two reasons. I think political violence has become somewhat normalized to some extent. And I think disinformation and misinformation is going to flow like we've never seen before. And those two things, kind of to build on Chris's anecdote, it doesn't take a lot of people with bad intent and the willingness to do bad things to create a lot of havoc. I mean, it doesn't take a lot. So I think the system can make it past the election. Usually the way democracies decline is not through an immediate breakdown. It's usually through an erosion. Some call it a slow erosion. And I often talk to my students asking them, how do you know in the midst of the slow erosion that the slow erosion is happening? How do you know if it's slow or fast? And I think that I think whoever is running the government in the next administration, I think that's going to be the added test, because I don't think the pressure is going to be let off. And I think I can imagine different presidents responding differently to that pressure. And I think that depending on how elites react to that pressure after the election, then I think, yeah, I mean, look, just the final point. Fareed Zakaria said this over the weekend. He was on this talking about his book. And I don't know how much I believe this, but he said, look, in 1933, there were more Nobel Prize winners in Germany than in the UK and in America combined. Germany's constitution was more liberal, a better constitution than ours. And if you wanted to trade places, whether you wanted to be a Jewish person in Germany at the time or a Black person in America, you would choose to be a Jewish person in Germany. And that, because of what had transpired the last 10 years, right? Preceding that came crumbling down within a few years after 33, right? So I think that I've been thinking about that, just about like, have we been going through this slow erosion where something could happen more immediately after the election? That I don't think so. I think the chances are more likely now than probably any other time during my lifetime, but I don't know what I wouldn't say that it's more likely than not. Sorry, Tim, go ahead.
I have nothing to add, because I resist kind of the crystal ball. I mean, we all resist that, and so it's a difficult question, David. But
Yeah.
It's yeah, the stress test. I have this is kind of pretty visceral for me. I had a series of events in the election of 2008 that caused a lot of stress in my and my family's life, based upon some events that took place that fall. So um, the stress, I think Chris's comment, I mean, I don't want to live through a stress test either. I just was appalled at January of 2021. I don't, I just cringe. I just cringe.
So go ahead, Chris.
I went back to Mike's thing on slow erosion. Do you think when the First Amendment is going to be curtailed, it's going to be because of jackbooted thugs going in and seizing printing press and the method for sending out information, or is it going to be the slow erosion of billionaires deciding to withdraw from the political debate that that their publications have always participated in? Because I think we're seeing the slow erosion right now.
Well, it
And
could be both.
I'm sorry.
It could be both, Chris. Don't you think?
Well, I'm saying it could be, yeah, because there's one candidate that has said people should have their license revoked. There's a
Yeah.
candidate that's saying that we should revoke licenses for news organizations.
Mhm.
There's another candidate. The candidate is saying that people that have opposed me should be brought in front of military tribunals. So the idea, if I'm looking into my crystal ball, and prognosticating, which I'm a Cubs fan. I do that every spring, and it's always gloomy, always. But the thing is, what if I get so big deal if I'm wrong? If I'm wrong in this case, the idea that I do believe that there's one candidate that provides a direct threat to our constitutional system, because I don't think our constitutional system, back to your original question, David, could actually could constrain if the people in power will use those constraints. But they've demonstrated time and time again that they're not willing to use that constitutional power to constrain. And so this is my thing is, what? I can look in and say, what? I missed a boat on that. And that's okay, because the outcome on the other side is too scary to think about. When you're talking about, this is a guy, this is cut to the chase. This is a guy, when he was in office, said, can't you just shoot the protesters in the leg? This is what, this is coming out of people that were in his cabinet. Can't you just shoot the protesters in the leg? So yeah, I'm willing to prognosticate here and say that's probably not where we want to go, because that is a stress on the system, and they're not going to have the people like Chief of Staff Milley. You're not going to have big guys like Mattis. You're not going to have other people in there that they're going to maybe keep those guardrails in place. So I'm sorry to get all political, and I know that's not constitutional, but it scares the bejesus out of me.
Well, I think that's part of it. Is I think it's fair to say that all of us are feeling a little bit of anxiety, a lot due to January 2021. The last question I have for us that I'd like to discuss is kind of what happens afterwards, and the Democratic campaign is pounding very heavily in their ad buys and their advertisements and stuff on something called Project 2025. They express a fear that this document lays out the foundation for an authoritarian system, which undermines our constitutional government. Project 2025 has been tied to President Trump. He denies that he has anything to do with it, but there's some evidence to show that his fingerprints are all over it. I've gone through it, not with a fine-tooth comb, but I've gone through it, and I'm wondering, to what degree are the ideas presented in the document just they're political, and they're political debates, but they're not constitutional that is that the document is not a threat to the constitutional system we have. It's an expression of political policies that a lot of people may not like, but it's not a threat. It's not a call for authoritarian government that undermines constitutional democracy, such as getting rid of certain cabinet positions. All right, like the Department of Education. Well, I may not like that. I may like that, but that's not a constitutional problem. They can do that. Civil service reform. All right, clearly they can do that if they want to fire everybody and reclassify people. My understanding is politically, constitutionally, there's no prohibition of that. They can go ahead and do that. Mass deportation of allegedly 20 million illegal migrants is not constitutionally prohibited. It's a political policy we may not like. So I'm wondering about your guys' take on this criticism of this paper, 900 pages or whatever it was, number of pages. Is it really a constitutional commentary, or is it more of a political policy commentary, and one that we don't need to be that worried about? Who wants to jump on the bandwagon?
I will jump in because I read the damn thing over the weekend, all 938 pages.
So I was right; it was 900.
Yeah, oh yeah, it was a blessing, let me tell you. Um,
Wow,
I
you are my
mean,
hero.
I need a vacation, frankly.
You are the wind beneath my wings, my friend.
Well, you stop it.
Did you think it was Project 1725? Is that what you were?
Yeah, then I'd be interested, right? Yeah, so I guess I'm a little bitter at this whole episode because I had to read Project 2025. I think your point's well taken, David. And as I read it, I didn't see it particularly as constitutional. However, because I think you're right, there's all kinds of unbelievable policy recommendations that may or may not float your boat. Um, but I do think the constitutional implications of check and balance and separation of powers, because so much of what's in these policy recommendations is, to your point, there is some elimination of agencies. There's some consolidation of agencies. There's actually some increase in funding in some agencies, decrease in funding in others. But I think, you're right, David, those aren't straight up constitutional issues, but many of their proposals puts those agencies under the direct aegis of the president and makes them political appointments rather than civil service employees. And now that to me, I think does become a power issue of separation of powers and check and balance if these policies are implemented. Again, at face value, I don't see the constitutional red flags, but I can see how they could be if this consolidation and reorganization takes place under a conservative, and they use that phrase all the time, under the next conservative executive, under the next conservative executive. So, I mean, to me, their foreign policy suggestions um, to me, that those were the scariest pieces of the Project 2025.
Right, but there's still political decisions.
Correct, correct.
Right, and I'm just, and it seems like many of these ultimately are going to take congressional action.
Well, that's the great naivete, I think, of the document too.
Well, it might be naivete, but it tells me that maybe the election for Congress is more important than the election for the executive. I don't know.
Well,
I'm just thinking out loud.
yeah, but they do make an argument that a lot of this is already under executive power through executive orders
Yeah.
and administrative decisions. So for some of it, they don't need Congress. At least the way I read it. I see Chris is agreeing with that. So I think I'm in good ground there if I'm reading a presentism document, and I've got Chris's approval.
A lot can be done.
Yeah, you two just let me know when you need some time alone, and Mike and I'll step out.
I don't know. I did not say that Tim was the wind beneath my wings, so I didn't go that far.
All right, Mike or Chris, you guys want to follow up on Tim?
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I kind of read it the same way. I mean, I kept reading it thinking, what is in here that is just obviously unconstitutional. And I didn't see a lot of that. I saw a lot of existing, like the Insurrection Act. I mean, it's a law the president can use. I think what the opponents of this are looking at is saying, like, yeah, president may have these powers, like even the appointment stuff. That's a Schedule F thing that the president can do on his own to
Yeah.
right? But it's like we haven't had really an executive who would be willing to push it this far. And isn't the logic, I mean, isn't the very logic of the three branches of government, as the students, we all learn it, is that these institutions are supposed to be jealous of their own power. That Congress as an entity will not want the executive getting too big. And the Supreme Court as an entity is going to check, right? And as we talked about on numerous programs, I think largely because of partisanship and the role of political parties and maybe political culture, we can't depend at all on Congress or the Supreme Court checking the executive, no matter who the executive is. If I think, well, you know what I'm trying to say. I think the system is not working the way Federalist 51 said it was going to work. And that's what really worries me, is because the system is built to check itself. And right now I don't see that whole machinery working the way it should.
Chris?
Yeah, you guys are right. It's policy, right? It's not, but it is constitutional in terms of what the executive power is. It really, I mean, now think about this. This is the thought. If we were not in the current time frame right now, who would be Mr. Unitary Executive? Who would be the poster child in the last 15 to 20 years for unitary executive? I'm going to go with Dick Cheney.
Okay. Yeah.
And he is against this because that might want to, that tells me something, because when I read and I got full disclosure, Tim, I have not read all 938 pages.
You're better off. You're better off. You'll have to trust me, Chris. You'll have to trust me.
I do. But
did you ever know that you're my? Okay, sorry. Go ahead.
The golly, that train just got totally derailed. The unitary executive that this will create, without needing Congress, is back to Mike's point about ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And you're right, but the thing is, so if Dick Cheney is against this, that must tell you that it's nefarious. And the Schedule F thing, the idea that you're going to stack your administration with loyalists, there's going to be a litmus test, right? And granted, you know what? Every president, the spoil system, going back to Andrew Jackson, 1824, which is, it's not Western Pennsylvania, it's 1824. So we understand the spoil system. But, I'm thinking of, was it Nixon that would walk through the West Wing to look for photographs of JFK on people's desks and have them removed? So that to me is scary. And I was just thinking too of the Enabling Act after the Reichstag was burned. So after the Reichstag was burned, here's the chancellor, gets all this power. And after that, it's, that's what, 33, 34, 1933, 34 in Germany. Hindenburg is pretty much pushed out, and, Hitler then assumes that total control. And we've already got a Supreme Court that has granted immunity to the president for official actions, whatever official actions are. I think it, to me, is kind of scary, honestly.
So we're going to wrap it up there. We've kind of gone a little bit over our hour here. So final thoughts, recommendations. Yeah, Chris?
Well, we're recording this the day after a rally at Madison Square Garden. And the rhetoric that was used at this rally, Stephen Miller, one of the close advisors of former President Trump, you know, America is for Americans only. That's exactly what Hitler said. Germany was for Germans only and the German people only. The idea that, and you know, the idea, Dave, that we're going to round up 20 million people and deport them. How many people are in this country illegally? 13 million. So if we round up some people that happen to be American citizens, we're going to deport them as well. Um, the language for the students watching this, really go look at the language that was used in this rally in Madison Square Garden, and go back and look at the rally that was there in 1939 with the big portraits of George Washington on the stage, and next to those big portraits of George Washington were Nazi swastikas.
Right. They can check that out on Ken Burns' documentary on the Holocaust. He's got some film from that there. You know, it's rhetoric. One thing I think about, Chris, is that, you know, that rhetoric, yeah, it's been increased. It's been, you know, the heat's risen since 2016 and 2020. But if we look, you know, he did not accomplish much of the rhetoric that he said before being elected in 2016. His wall was not built. Mexico did not pay for it. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was not put on trial and not sent to prison, kind of stuff. So I just wonder, to what extent is this just rhetoric, and it's also a reflection of our popular culture today, kind of thing. And it's rhetoric to get elected, but once elected, it'll be just another 4 years of a vanity moment, kind of thing. You know, again, I wonder. It doesn't diminish my anxiety, but I wonder about that. So, gentlemen, final thoughts, recommendations for students and teachers as they, themselves talk about this election, and as we go through it here in 8 or 9 days. Tim?
Yeah, as always, I'm going to say take two history lessons and call me in the morning. I think history in some ways can reduce some stress about this. You know, we've had these awful elections, and life went on, and some sense of normalcy occurs afterwards. So sometimes history can help. Now, I don't know that it automatically is a clean, you know, and therefore this is going to be that way. Because I think Axelrod, I was really taken with Axelrod's insight, because they were talking about past elections that were horrible, but Axelrod pushed back on Karl Rove a little bit and said, but the technology has enhanced our less than virtuous angels of our nature. So the technology piece, I think, really is troublesome to me in how it has just we've gone from 0 to 60 so fast. But you know, read a little history, and hopefully that'll maybe get some perspective on what we're going through.
Chris?
Yeah, I'm going to read from Astor Taylor's book. I want to make sure I get this right. So, taking advantage of and perpetuating, taking advantage of and perpetuating human idiocy is a profitable enterprise. The studies have shown a distrust of experts correlates with an increasing support for a strong leader, and decreasing support for democracy indicates that, for some authoritarians at least, the rewards are not solely financial. And this book came out. This is several years old, so this is not completely brand new. But I am not necessarily borrowing Dr. Moore's prescription of take 2 history tablets and call me in the morning, because of the threat of political violence. We saw political violence on January 6, 2021, and my fear is it's going to be worse this time, again, because of the pumps have been primed. People have been primed to believe this, and you saw this, as I mentioned earlier, There's no way we lose this. The only way we lose is if there's fraud. And this is the message that was in 2020, and this is the message that we're getting now. And it just scares the bejesus out of me, honestly.
Mike?
Yeah, I've been thinking this last week about if we reframe our timeline and if we imagine this is the 60th year of our experiment in liberal democracy, and to think about what's happened the last 60 years. By my count, there's been 5 major wars we've been involved with. There's been 8 recessions. We've seen globalization change the nature of our world, technological changes from a bipolar to a unipolar to some multipolar kind of international environment, to a society where 88% were non-white Hispanic to today where there's 59%, from a society that was about 5.4% foreign born to today 14% foreign born. Like, we are truly living in in great societal, economic, and technological change. And we're a young democracy trying to do this, trying to become the world's first multiracial democracy. And what strikes me about this is just, if we think about it from that perspective, to really think about, are our institutions able to withstand this much change? Political scientists have been thinking a lot the last 10 years about culture shift and the way it involves politics. And if we're right now living through the last gasp of a certain subpopulation in America, well, basically where whites were at the top of the social hierarchy. Is this the last, resistance to all this change, demographic changes? Or are we seeing with the Republican Party now and the MAGA movement an entirely new orientation, entirely new ideology about what it means to live in a world as different and as anxiety ridden it can be? So I don't know, when I just kind of cut down the timeline and think about everything we've been through as we've been trying to start our democracy in 65, it makes the task for all of us, I think, moving forward even more important to just be engaged. I didn't end that too well, but that's my thought. Sorry.
Well, Mike, I like what you said, but I would also, add that this, this change that is happening, this populist change, if we want to call that, this resistance to national change, is somewhat a global a movement going on. I mean, we can look at Turkey, we can look at Hungary, we can look at India, we can look at even Germany and France, Poland. There are similar movements going on, and a lot of it's about national identity. And you're right, it's only been about 60, 70 years in which we've become or attempted to become a multiracial, multicultural democracy in many ways. And I would say that's true for a lot of the world, that's a fairly modern phenomenon, and you're seeing some pushback on that, which very much has to do with this notion of identity there. Tim, I really liked your idea of just take 2 history pills, and but I do. But what's interesting is there's a lot of historians, intellectuals out there, academics who I respect, who are optimistic. They're optimistic about America. They look at American history and say, this too shall pass. Whereas there's another whole group of academics I tremendously respect who share more of a dark view of what could happen here. And what I'd say to students and teachers, the fun has already begun. As I noticed today in, what was it, Oregon and Washington, ballot drop boxes were set on fire recently and destroying ballots. And I just, now part of me on the historical side, I go back to the 19th century and elections and the violence associated with elections, which was kind of the norm in some ways, and kind of go, well, okay, this isn't that out of the step. But there's the other side of me that in my lifetime, the norm has become, no, we don't have violence during elections, kind of thing. So don't know what to do to tell you, students and teachers, other than I do hope that we've given you some things to think about, that we've tried to put the Constitution in perspective of the election, and that we'll know more in a couple of weeks there, and we'll maybe be able to chat. In our next session, we're going to be getting back to our original mission, and that is we're going to be dealing with Unit 1. So Unit 1 kids and teachers, be aware that we'll be talking about the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. Again, really controversial subjects, and the rule of law, which I think is apropos to what we've been talking about tonight. But until then, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Bye-bye. Bye, bonds.